Welcome tonight to our online at 5 service, and we're glad that you've chosen to join us for our part 3 of our January 2021 summer series, How to Squander Your Potential. Dion Primetime Sanders has a unique claim to fame. He has fulfilled his potential in a way that nobody else has. See, he is an outfielder for a professional baseball team and cornerback for a professional NFL team in America. Fact is, his claim to fame is that he is the only athlete who has managed to score both a major league home run and an NFL touchdown, not just at different points in his career, but in the same week. Talk about fulfilling potential. Now, if you know me, you might be a little bit surprised that I'm here talking about sports. I'm not really a sporty kind of guy. I don't even enjoy watching it. But the reason that I wanted to bring up Deion Sanders is because one time he was interviewed about how he was able to be as much of a success as he was. And he said that he was pushed forward by the idols in his life. He lived around a lot of idols as he grew up. If I'd have done this, I'd be making $3 million today. If I'd have practiced a little harder or a little more, I'd be a superstar. If I'd have just chosen differently in life, I would be fulfilling my potential. See, Dion grew up around a whole bunch of people who he describes as being as fast as him as kids. They had the same amount of potential, but they got distracted by the things of life. They got distracted by the things around them. They made choices and decisions that took them away from being able to fulfill their potential. But I love Dion's description of those idols. That stuck out to me because I think if we stopped and thought about it, we could all think about an idol that we know in our life. We can all think of someone who has said, if only I'd have done this, then I'd be better than I am now. And in fact, maybe the idol that you know is yourself. I've been an idol at many times in my life, thinking about what could have been if I'd maybe done things differently, if I'd made different choices. And so we're in our third week of our summer series, How to Squander Your Potential, and we're exploring the life of King Saul. And his was a life that was absolutely full of idols. If I'd have waited for Samuel, instead of giving in to fear and taking a shortcut, my son would be king after me. If I'd have not made the army pay for my selfishness and my pride, they would still respect me as king. If I'd have not pursued a foolish vow, my son might still respect me as a father. And today we're going to see King Saul add more idols to his life. We're going to see more ways in which he has squandered his God-given potential as Israel's first king as we work our way through 1 Samuel chapter 15. Let's begin this story with verses 1 to 9. Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. So listen now to the message from the Lord. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. Then he said to the Kenites, Go away, Leave the Amalekites so that I do not destroy you along with them. For you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites moved away from the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. So we have Samuel reminding himself of who he is to Saul. Now this seems a little bit weird because they knew each other. They maybe hadn't seen each other in a while. And this wasn't about Samuel had grown a new beard or he'd gotten a new haircut and was a little bit unrecognizable. No, Samuel introduces himself like this because he wants to direct Saul's attention in a very specific way. Samuel wants Saul focused on God. God is the one who chose you as king. He sent me to anoint you, remember? The good things that you have in your life, all the good things that you have, they have come from God. And God has something else for you to do. He has an important mission for you. And Samuel then goes on to share the mission that God had told him to tell Saul. And he says it in an incredibly detailed and specific manner. God is trying to be as clear and blunt as possible because he knows Saul's history. He knows that Saul has a history of using wiggle room in commandments, of being like some of those people that constantly look for the loophole. What was said and what wasn't said. You asked me to empty the bin? Fine. But I'm not going to put in a new bag because you asked me to empty it. See, God is wanting to avoid Saul wiggling out and misunderstanding the command that he's giving him. So Saul is given the what, the who, the where, the when, and even the why. Wouldn't it be nice if we got the why sometimes with what we need to do? He gives Saul everything he needs to carry out this instruction, and he knows that Saul has struggled with the commands in the past, so he's been as clear as possible. Samuel passes on the message and Saul sets off. Things are going well. Saul understands the why this is happening. And so when he sees the Kenites there, he knows that they're not included in this. So he tells them to move on, move away, move beyond this area. It looks like Saul is actually going to do exactly what God has asked. Things are all going so well, and then we get to verses 8 and 9, where Saul was disobedient again. Despite God's clear instructions, despite Samuel's reminders about where the commands were coming from, Saul makes the choice to disobey God, to trust in his own judgment. And this is actually one of the big truths about squandering your potential. It's not always about a single episode of your life. Squandering your potential is not always about a single decision in your life. Instead, it is about the culmination and the combination of the different decisions and choices that you make in your life. Saul, at this point, has gotten himself into a cycle of continued disobedience. God has given him so many opportunities and chances to fulfill his potential, to follow his commands, to obey, and Saul has continually chosen to disobey. Potential is great. Potential is exciting. Potential has so much promise. But if we want to realize that, We need to choose to be faithful over the long term. We have to choose to maximize it again and again and again. It is a continual choice to engage and to grow into our potential. It's a battle between continual faithfulness and continued disobedience. Because I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but you're not going to become a professional sportsman like Deion Sanders, who was able to play 2 different sports at a professional level if you make a decision once to go to practice. You're not going to be an example to the people in life around you just because you made one good decision. You aren't going to be able to step into your potential of leading your family to love God, to follow God, if you are not able to choose faithfulness over the long term, to let your life be an example of that. In order to maximize your potential, it requires a decision to continuously lean into it, to continuously choose faithfulness over disobedience. Saul allowed himself to fall into the pattern of disobedience. He continued to choose that over faithfulness to what God planned and desired. He chose disobedience when he allowed his pride and his arrogance to lead him. We were able to see Saul's pride last week as he sought retribution and mistook God's enemies for his enemies. It became all about Saul, and God was pushed out of the place in Saul's heart. That pride wasn't dealt with, and now it has grown to the point where Saul feels like he can actually make decisions and change what God has commanded him to do. His pride and his arrogance have come to the point where Saul goes, I know better than God. Saul chose disobedience when he allowed fear to control him all the way back at Gilgal, and that caused him to sacrifice when Samuel hadn't shown up. And it's still in play here as well. Saul is scared that the men are going to stop following him, that he's going to lose their respect, so he gives into them. He allows them to take the good things as plunder, even though they were dedicated to God. He takes the king so that the king is able to be paraded around, so that he can point out to his men and to his army, look at what we did. Look at who we conquered. You still need me because we did this while I was king. It's the fear of losing the men that is causing him to do it. But regardless of how he got into this cycle, that cycle of disobedience is something that we can be caught up in today as well. And maybe you have a habit that God is calling on you to give up. But you don't want to give it up. You don't understand why it's so wrong or why God might be saying no to it. And so your pride, like Saul's, is causing you to think that you know better than God. Or maybe it is a relationship that is drawing you away from God, a relationship that is taking more of your focus and your time and your energy, and you're choosing to say no to God and yes to that instead. Maybe you have a fear that the people around you are going to leave, so in order to keep them around, you make decisions that shut God out of your life. Maybe you struggle with giving up control. Deep down, there's something in you that doesn't want to give up control, and so you resist God's commands. You resist giving yourself to Him, allowing Jesus to be Lord of your life, as Simona talked about last week. Maybe you have a fear of what might happen if you actually listen to God's still small voice inside. If you allow yourself to step out in faith, to see what God might have in store for you and plan for you, and so you ignore it, you shut it out, and so you're disobedient to it. regardless of what the disobedience is. When we continually choose to disobey, the result is the same. And we see it in the next section of our text. Let's keep reading. 1 Samuel 15, 10-12 says this. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me, has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was angry. He cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone down to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. God comes and he speaks to Samuel. And as he does so, he reveals an important lesson from Saul's life, which is this. Continual choices against God harden our hearts to God. Let me say that again. Continual choices against God harden our hearts to God. Saul's choices of disobedience meant that he began to continually turn himself away from God, away from what God was calling on him to do as the king of Israel. Not only did he squander his potential, but he entered into a cycle where it would be harder and harder and harder for him to hear God's promptings for him in the future. It is so much easier to walk down a well-worn path than to forge a new path. It is so much easier to go down into a place when our habits and our past have already made a path down to it. The more we disobey, the more we shut God's voice off, the more we ignore it, the easier disobedience becomes. God didn't allow his mission and his work to be stopped just because Saul disobeyed. Saul didn't stop God's plans. Instead, God took the mission and the role that he had given Saul and he gave it to Samuel. Samuel became the instrument of God's justice. In verse 33, we're told that Samuel was the one that ended up putting Agag, king of the Amalekites, to death, fulfilling the justice that God had decreed upon them. We are not big enough or powerful enough to upset God's plans. God is a believer in free will for us. If we choose to be disobedient, if we choose to close our ears and our hearts to what he is saying, to harden them against what he is calling us to do, he will allow that. God will listen when we choose to cut him out of our lives. He will allow us to harden our hearts. He will allow us to fall deeper and deeper into sin. And the scary thing is, the harder that your heart becomes to God, the harder it is to realize that and to choose to repent. The harder it is to notice and to do something about it, to choose to be obedient and not disobedient. It becomes harder, but never impossible. And so as we look at our God-given potential for this year, as we look at our God-given potential for the rest of our lives, there's a question that I have for you, and it's this. How is your heart towards God at the moment? Is it soft and tender? Or is it starting to go a little bit stale and hard, like bread left out on the bench? Have you allowed disobedience to God to sneak into your life? Is your potential being squandered because you've allowed your heart to harden against him? It becomes hard to recognize when our hearts are hardened to God. But a revelation from God, even a hard heart can be overcome. Whether that revelation comes from a friend or from something you notice, Or even it might be that the tapping of that still small voice inside your heart is heard. And becomes possible to overcome a hard heart. But if we want to maximize our potential, it is better that we don't allow our hearts to harden in the first place. But we need to stop and we need to reflect regularly to check it. We need to meet with other believers and allow them opportunities to speak into our lives to let us know when that might be happening. And if our hearts do begin to become hard, we need to repent, to seek God again. God promises in Jeremiah 29:13 that when we seek him with our whole heart, we will find him. But if we allow our hearts to remain hardened, well, verse 12 warns us what comes next. Saul's hard heart has led him to construct a monument in his own honor. And I find it ironic that in last week's reading, after Saul had already been king for a while, it was recorded that for the first time, Saul made an altar to the Lord. And this week, in the very next chapter, we find that Saul's heart has completely turned from God. He now creates a monument for his own honor. His heart is hard indeed. Saul has decided he doesn't need God anymore. His pride and his arrogance, his disobedience has hardened his heart to the point where he goes, I am the one that deserves praise, not God. How did Saul get to this point? Well, Saul squandered his potential through shallow knowledge of God. We see in 1 Samuel 10:9-10 that God changed Saul's heart. He gave him a new heart, and then God sent his spirit powerfully upon Saul. Saul had a mountaintop experience. Now, I've had those moments. I've felt those times when God's Spirit has been powerfully at work in my life. But you know what? Those aren't the everyday experiences. They are not all the time experiences. Those experiences are not enough. Please don't misunderstand me. Those experiences are good. Those experiences are wonderful. And those experiences help sustain us through difficult and hard times of faith. We should be wanting those experiences. We should be wanting to grow deeper with God, but when our faith is just based off those mountaintop experiences, it's no help when we go to the valleys. It will cause us to make the same mistakes as Saul. See, God gave Saul the tools that he needed to fulfill his God-given potential. God set Saul up to succeed. He supplied him with the tools. He gave him a new heart, a fresh start. He gave him his potential. He gave him Samuel to help guide and give instruction and advice. But what Saul was missing was the knowledge and the understanding to go from a very surface level knowledge of God to a living and real relationship with God. We can see this in verses 13 and 15, which say, when Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Saul answered, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." What? Saul's continued disobedience, his hard heart, must have knocked a couple of screws loose in his head. Because Saul greets Samuel with the words, "I have carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel, he's on the ball, and he points out the noise of the sheep and the cows behind them as they talk. This is like a toddler. You've just walked into the room and you ask them, have they eaten the chocolate that was sitting on the bench? And they look up at you with eyes wide open. They look at you with all the innocence in the world and they say, no. And you say, are you sure? And they nod. And all the while you're just looking at the chocolate that is smeared in front and across their face. Saul is being incredibly childish about this. Now, I don't know if it was always Saul's plan that the loot that they took would be a sacrifice to God, or if this was just quick thinking on his part. Whether this was him trying to get out of trouble and thinking on his feet. Regardless, it is Saul's understanding here that reveals just how poor an understanding of God he actually had. Samuel clarifies the issue in verse 22. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. Saul thought God was more interested in sacrifices for the sake of sacrifices. Saul didn't attempt to worship any of the gods from the nations around Israel. But it's obvious that Saul mistook God for being just like the gods of those nations. Saul failed to see how the God of Israel was any different to those in the surrounding nations. He couldn't see a difference because his understanding was surface level. Saul's arrogance and his pride, out of control due to his continued disobedience and his hardened heart towards God, made him think that he could just obey God's commands on his own terms. That it was a pick and choose kind of situation that he could adapt. After all, he's king. He could obey what he wanted. He could decide differently when he wanted to as well. Saul didn't understand that God is holy. Saul didn't understand God's majesty. He didn't understand that God is the creator of all the earth, the creator of everything in it, that everything already belongs to him and is his. Most of all, he didn't understand that what God really wants, what God desires above all else, is a heart that is tender towards him, to build a relationship with him. God, our God, wants a relationship with his creations. Saul didn't understand that God is a shepherd and we are his sheep, that he cares for us, that he loves us. He's wanting to look after us and protect us. He wants us to fulfill our potential that God himself gave to us. Of course, he wants us to fulfill that. He gave it to us. And so how do we develop that tender heart? Well, we need to build a relationship. We need to spend time with him, looking towards him. We need to choose obedience to his commands, not just our own judgment. We may not understand what God is trying to do at the beginning. We may not even understand this side of eternity. But to obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams. We need to trust that God is our Father. He loves us. He cares for us. He's our God and our Creator, and he has amazing plans for us. Ephesians 2:10 reminds us not only that God created us, but that he has good works for us to do, that he has already prepared in advance for us to do. We have potential to do amazing things if we don't squander it. He's given us potential. He has works for us to do, but in order for that to happen, we have to trust him, obey him, develop a relationship with him. God's not interested in just meaningless sacrifice. He's not interested in empty rituals. God isn't interested in you just trying to tick a box saying, I've come to church today. I have tithed today. I helped somebody today. I helped that old lady across the street. Serving God is not a to-do list that we pick and choose according to how we feel on the day. Each of those things above are good. Each of those things are disciplines that we should do and sacrifice even when we don't feel like doing it. But each of those things is designed to make our hearts tender before God. When we come to church, it's not about us sacrificing an hour of our lives. It's about us meeting with fellow believers, worshiping God together and sharpening each other to have a tender heart towards God, to know him more. When we tithe, we are showing God that we trust him. We are putting our trust in him, that he has provided for us and that we don't need to hold on to everything so tightly. But we know that God has made everything, so we give it back. When we help people, we are showing the love of Christ to them. And as we demonstrate that love ourselves, God is showing us how he loves us as well. We deepen our relationship. We deepen our understanding. God doesn't want us to tick the box of ritual, of meaningless sacrifice, of empty obligations. God wants us to obey because he knows what is best for us. And he wants to grow a deeper and greater relationship with him. He is our Father who wants a relationship with his children. And so if we want to fulfill our God-given potential in life, if we want to ensure that we can achieve those things that God has set aside for us in 2021, if we don't want God to give them to somebody else to do, then we need to follow Samuel's example, not Saul's. After all, Samuel demonstrated a life of continual obedience to God's will, not disobedience. Unlike Saul, Samuel was not caught up in a cycle of disobedience, nor did Samuel harden his heart. Instead, throughout his life, Samuel sought to grow a deeper understanding with God, a deeper relationship with God, listening to his voice, hearing what God was actually wanting to say to him and say about him. And then, even in those times where he was worried or scared about what God was asking him to do, Samuel obeyed. He chose to step out in obedience to God, even if it was scary, even if it was hard, even if he was worried about it. He was faithful. He was fully obedient to God, and because of that, he achieved his God-given potential. So in 2021, my prayer is that you will know God, and that you'll know that he's not just desiring a superficial knowledge about him. He wants a relationship with you. He wants a deep understanding. He wants a deep relationship that is going to grow as we draw closer to him through our decisions. Through our continued choices, we can move closer and closer to God and realize the God-given potential for our lives.